Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Kevin Olsen. Kevin is the owner and president of Teton Mediaworks, and he is the publisher of Jackson Hole News and Guide. Welcome, Kevin.
Emmy, hi, welcome. Thank you. Great to be on the program.
Well, thanks for taking the time. And I wanted to start off our conversation by just kind of knowing a little bit more about you and how long you've lived in Jackson and why it became your home. And what was your journey here?
Okay. My wife, Shelly, and I moved from Mission Viejo, California back in 2001. The short story is that a good friend of ours in California used to live in Jackson and knew Mike Sillett, who was the longtime owner and publisher of the Jackson Hole News. And as the story goes, she said, "Hey, Mike's looking for someone to run his newspaper. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Where?" And she said, "Jackson Hole, Wyoming." I'm like, "Jackson Hole, the ski place?" Because I was kind of a ski bum at heart. And she said, "Yep." So I reached out to Mike, and happily ever after, we've been here now for 19 years, having back in 01 moved our small family at the time here and got seated in. I was the associate publisher of the Jackson Hole News for a year, and then we merged with the Jackson Hole Guide. And so that created the Jackson Hole News and Guide in 2002. And of course, it's been the county paper of record in Teton County ever since. So that's the short version of how we ended up here.
Well, what is your business background?
My degree from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Telecommunication at Arizona State University was in journalism, but my kind of area of focus was public relations and advertising. And that was really the area that I wanted to head into from a career standpoint. But the cards weren't right at the time in the time I graduated from school. So I started my first job with the Orange County Register in Southern California and kind of worked my way up the business and marketing and management side of the media company versus the journalism news side of the media company. But as fate would have it, as time went by working at the Orange County Register, I found myself going between the news side of the business and the business side of the business, trying to create new products, reaching emerging audiences. And so that's how I kind of got my publisher hat fit to my head.
Publisher hat. Well, so that just leads me to tell me more about Teton Mediaworks, because as you mentioned before, it's a complete umbrella for several different publications.
When I purchased the business from my predecessor, Mike Sillett, back in December of 2012, I envisioned us being more than just a newspaper. I envisioned us being more of a diversified media company because I saw the landscape in front of us and the disruption that was happening across all facets of the media business. And I knew that you couldn't stand on one leg. Newspapers alone. And so fortunately, we had a fledgling magazine division that was growing and gaining more advertiser and reader share, both for locals and visitors. And so we propped up that division alongside our two newspapers, the Jackson Hole News and Guide and the Jackson Hole Daily. So at that stage of the game, we had two of four legs of the stool that I ultimately want to create for our company. The third leg was to create digital marketing capabilities so that as businesses in Jackson wanted to diversify how they advertise and market themselves, certainly print is and has been very strong because of the high market penetration of our newspaper products in this market. But businesses want to do more in video, and they want to do more in social media, and they want to make sure their brand is on target and the communication coming out to its constituents is reaching them in ways that activate their interest in those businesses. And so we acquired a startup company called Origin Media back in 2016. And that created the third pillar where we were able to, or the third leg, we were able to offer digital marketing services to businesses in and around Jackson, but really throughout the Rocky Mountains. And Scott Page heads up a talented group of people who can build websites, they can produce videos, they can look inside a company's communication tactics and recommend ways to do it better, reaching their customer base more effectively. They do commercial photography. So that was a really important third leg. And our fourth leg as we move forward into the future is to understand all of the points of interaction that we have with consumers and businesses in our market through our products print, through our products digital, and the different business services that we have, and create a data repository where we can create a business connecting businesses with consumers through the data trove that we'll be able to develop in the years ahead. So that's kind of the multifaceted four-pillar, four-legged stool that we envision for our diversified media company.
Well, I think it's interesting that you had that vision way back when, and here we are in the digital world now more than ever, probably.
Yeah.
How do you see people still embracing print? How do you see people still embracing the Jackson Hole News and Guide printed? Not the online one, but the printed one.
Yeah, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. We produce virtually the same number of print newspapers today, little asterisk, except for COVID, than we did years ago. So we're in a very unique market situation here in Jackson and really in Wyoming, where, the progressive adaptation of digital is not as advanced as we see in the metro markets, where the media landscape has been completely, blown up and disrupted and diversified, and has been really challenging for the news media business. But, here in Wyoming, here in Jackson Hole, people still embrace the slowness, if you will, of leaning back, reading the news, understanding how it fits their life, what they are passionate about, what they want to advocate for, what they want to participate in. And so we see newspaper readership still very strong. Going back to the asterisk on COVID, what we saw during the lockdowns is access to the papers where people would normally get them was virtually shut off. And so we did see website readership, and more specifically subscriptions for our digital replica newspapers, both the Weekly News and Guide and the daily Jackson Hole Daily, spike as a result of those lockdowns. And ultimately that's good for our future, because if we have that recurring subscription revenue by engaged residents and even seasonal residents who are now reading their paper back in Greenwich, Connecticut, because they are vested in Jackson Hole, that recurring reader revenue is really what helps fund journalism long term.
What I think is interesting about small town newspapers is that they seem really relevant in this day and age. That is such a community minded thing, is to have, your local newspaper where everything in that newspaper, I mean, I know you do national and international news as well, but you really focus on your community.
In the Jackson Hole News and Guide, it's 100% deep dive in the community, yes. And so our ultimate path to a reader is, we know that people come perhaps when they're younger, or perhaps when they're just new to the market and they're still trying to figure everything out. But once they get settled in, once they get jobs, once they get married, once they have kids, once they're on boards, they need to know what's going on in our community. And so the Jackson Hole News and Guide's weekly approach of everything local, deep and wide, has served, our community well, but it's developed by some super pro journalists who have a great vision on bringing to life what happens every day in Jackson Hole and summarizing it in that weekly report.
Do you consider the News and Guide to be a centrist, not a liberal, not a conservative paper? You try and stay in the center? What do you think?
Absolutely have to, and try to with all of our might. There understandably is a lot of criticism towards media these days of being a right-leaning or being a left-leaning paper. We steer clear of all of that, excuse my French, crap, because our job is not to polarize. Our job is to objectively inform. And so our center point is the truth. Let's boil this whole down. Let's boil all this down. Let's talk to the sources. Let's determine where the truth lies in anything, whether it doesn't get that intense with a feature story on, a biologist doing work in the National Elk Refuge. But when it comes to controversial topics, we have to stay down the center, present both sides. Our reporters are trained to include that in their news reporting. Our editors are trained to look for little diversions that may lead a reader to think that, we're trying to angle or slant, but that's not our job. We produce an apolitical paper for people to make their own decisions. We've got an intelligent market here, and we just want to provide the information. They can take it and decide what they want to do with it.
So I guess you are in a very unique position, but I also understand that newspapers throughout the U.S. receive a lot of their content from press releases, right? And so how do you guard yourself against fake news? If you're just like having press releases come in on different candidates, especially in the national arena, how do you guard against what is pertinent to write about and what should we just ignore?
Okay. You're starting to touch on a really key point, and that's the difference between local news media and national news media. We're not inundated with the things that you let out with, angling releases, trying to persuade or advocate for certain positions. We're more inundated, if you will, with releases from, the local arts organizations or the local conservation organizations or local businesses. And so, we'll take those releases. It's our internal protocols that we do original reporting on press releases. And that happens 97% of the time. The other 3% is when we just don't have the staff time to do our own original reporting, but we know who the source of that press release was. We can read the authenticity of the information there, and we want our readers to know about it. So we'll print that. A great example is the Jackson Hole Historical Society and Museum just recently completing the purchase of their land in downtown Jackson. That came in as a press release. We ran it as a press release because we understood all those factors that I just mentioned. We wanted to get that information to our readers because that was a big effort that consumed a lot of time and energy last year and into the winter and the summer for the museum.
So there's some very national topics that boil down into very local topics like immigration and housing and women's issues, for example. How do you deal with those kinds of issues on a local level?
Thanks for bringing that up. We will definitely look at what's playing outside of our little cocoon here and take a national topic, but look at it through a local lens. So when it comes to a topic like women's issues or immigration, we're going to be seeking local sources on the ground to interpret that national movement or that national issue and what it means to them here, what it means to us here. So we'll report through their eyes using the national spectrum as context, but we'll tell the story through the local angle.
Yeah, so there's some things that were in the news recently and that were pretty contentious. And I won't mention names, but I guess I might as well mention names because I'll just give it away anyway, about our mayor and accusations that were being made. And that was pretty sensitive in a lot of ways.
It was intense. Yep.
Yeah. Whatever side you thought you were on.
Yes.
So how do you choose to handle that? Especially when you know people's lives, people who live here, their reputations are at stake. How do you deal with that?
So typically, things will come to a news reporter in the form of a tip or a rumor or an email or a phone call. And it's that reporter's job to understand a little bit more. And so there's a process of vetting and probing, interaction with his or her editor to seek guidance on how to pursue this topic professionally, ethically, responsibly, making sure that we abide by, some of the tenets that we hold true to that's consistent across all of our journalistic reporting. In the case of a rumor or a tip, our job number one is to go to the authorities and find out if what we're hearing is true or if there's evidence or a report or a filing or a claim, things of those nature. And once it's determined that there is something there, we go to the sources. And generally speaking, the sources want to let their side be known or they don't. And if they don't, then it's our job to find out why and then start to do some investigating to see if there's more to this story than what it appears at face value. So nothing we do is scattershot. Everything we do when it comes to contentious, controversial matters where public figures are being called into question, we've got a process. We roll through the process. The process sometimes takes time, maybe more time than what people would like, but we're not going to come out and publish a story until we've got the I's dotted, the T's crossed, and it passes our internal test of integrity and trustworthiness so that it's ready to print.
So how involved do you get in the process of, you have an editor, but you're the publisher and you have writers, and how involved you get in decision making on whether or not a story is published or not?
I'm glad you asked, because that is a sense of mystery for many people when it comes to media. Back to and I'll answer your question real specifically, but back to your earlier point about the national media and, that's a left-leaning, TV station, or that's a right-leaning website. We are independently owned and operated, and I can choose how we want to publish our newspapers and our news, which is now published on news or in papers and online. In our case, my job as publisher is strategy and business. Like, I got to make sure we have all the business fundamentals in place so that we can support the staffing of a newsroom who follows a very calculated approach to reporting and disseminating news in our market. I choose to allow my editors and their experience and professionalism to handle 99% of decisions that go down in the newsroom. When there's something of larger significance, I'm alerted, and I will certainly want to be involved in those discussions more from a steering standpoint, because I want our staff to be convicted and make decisions on what they feel is best for our readers, not necessarily based on pressure from a publisher. So I try and stay away from getting close to the readers. The editors and the reporters are the closest to the readers, and these people are pros. They wouldn't work here if they weren't. And so they take great care and concern for how some of these stories work their way from tip or concept to publication and presentation. So I am not involved in the day-to-day idea generation or editing or vetting of stories. We have much more talented people than me doing that.
Well, I'm sure that's not true because you had this great vision for the paper. But I also am interested in how, even though we're a small town, we're kind of a big town in a big way, just because of where we live. Our proximity to Yellowstone, our proximity in the world makes us a bigger place than we are.
For sure.
And so, what's your relationship with the larger national media organizations like, the New York Times or the Washington Post? Or what kind of conversations are publishers having about the future of newspapers in general, not specifically, the Jackson Hole News and Guide, but just where is journalism going?
Relationship and futures. Let me address relationship. We really don't have a relationship with the larger metropolitan newspapers other than subscribing to some of their syndication services that we use in the Jackson Hole Daily. So we will use Washington Post columnists, New York Times columnists, Creators Syndicate columnists, and believe me, Pamela Perricone, the editor of the Jackson Hole Daily, goes through these columns with great concern for representing a balance of viewpoints by the time they hit the opinion page of the Jackson Hole Daily. More, though, we'll talk to regional publishers that are, doing kind of the same stuff we are, working within communities, 20 to 50,000 residents, and just trying to benchmark and learn and understand how they're doing things so that we can try and improve our game and not become complacent with how we do our work here in Jackson Hole. Journalism as a profession and as a trade has definitely gotten some black eyes in the last 10 years in two respects. One, financially, it costs a lot of money to support a quality staff of journalists. And when advertisers choose to do different things with their ad dollars and advertising diminishes within the publications that those journalists work for, you'll have fewer journalists. I mean, I don't know of many businesses that will operate at a negative margin, but you can't do that for very long. There is a movement in our industry of philanthropy supporting journalists, and I think that effort will still be on the incline, particularly in markets where journalism is being squeezed out by the economics of those markets. In markets where journalism can be supported, fully and fairly, they do the work that needs to be done to keep community members engaged in their community. You can always tell the health of a community by looking at its local newspaper. And I don't have a direct scientific correlation here, but, Emmy, you travel, take a look at the local newspaper in towns that you really like to visit and hang out at, and you usually have a healthy paper, and it's the content, the vitality that the information provides its readers that keep people engaged. The number one enemy of communities across our nation is apathy. People getting too busy, too wrapped up, and not looking out and seeing how they can participate and make things better in the communities that they live. And that just takes some time and some effort and some elbow grease and some prioritization to do that. And so, journalism going into the future is solid. The funding of it is going to bounce around. It's going to be challenging. There are going to be fewer, which means the fewer that there are, the more disciplined they must be at presenting a fair and balanced, although that's a pretty commonly used word these days for a popular news channel. The reality is that, the objectivity that can be offered through journalism is what's really needed, especially in times as contentious as we're in right now politically.
Right. It's going to be interesting. Well, for you, it's going to be really important how you publish the outcome of our election results that are coming up.
Well, there's those two levels again, bumping up against each other. What I was saying earlier, and I'm sorry to talk over you, is that all I really have to worry about is the local election, because that's our framework for our news resources. And so, we will provide an objective and accurate report based on the information we're provided by the clerk's office on the election results locally, and we'll have a good night's sleep. And then we'll leave the national stuff to the national people. That being said, the Jackson Hole Daily, one of its secret sauces, if you will, has been that it takes a step out into the nation and the world and, into business, and provides an encapsulated report for people who just want to simply know what's going on. And, they'll have their work cut out, but they use the Associated Press, which is, that's vetting news organizations providing that material to the Associated Press. They have their own editors and fact checkers that then will go through those published news stories to condense it down and then syndicate it to us. They're not perfect. We're not perfect, but we're all striving for the same thing, which is that accuracy and objectivity. So I was going to say guarantee. I don't want to say that. I know that we'll get the news that the Associated Press has vetted, and that's what will turn out for the next day's paper on Wednesday, November 4th in the Jackson Hole Daily.
It's a big day, big time.
Yeah.
Kevin, what is the role of social media in journalism?
I think, social media in our playbook, its primary role is distribution of our content. So we will post select stories to social media so that people see something that, if they hadn't had a chance to read the paper this week, might capture their interest and then divert them into reading that story. So for the most part, that works really well. Where social media starts to become a little bit problematic for me as a publisher is in two areas. And I'll just touch on these lightly. One is just the commentary that devolves from social media posts. I wish that people would speak in social media like you and I are speaking now. We have a certain sense of respect. We're people. If I'm looking at you, I say things direct to you. And it seems like social media comments devolve into name calling. Just a lot of unproductive stuff happens there. And I don't think it would happen if we were just sitting here talking together. So unfortunately, that exists. And I don't know how to resolve that other than, with the Jackson Hole News and Guide, we've updated our commenting protocols on our articles where, your name, you have to have your name there. You can't do it anonymously. And you need to be a subscriber, because we find that if we have this bond together, we both subscribe, we're engaged in the community, we'll talk to each other in a little bit more of a respectful way. The other thing that I see with social media where it kind of goes south is people, it's kind of like use social media at your own risk. People will tend to like and follow people and organizations whose views fit theirs. And so you end up with this proverbial echo chamber of content in your news feed that leaves you somewhat resistant to other points of view that don't necessarily enter into your feed. And anytime that enters into your feed, then whoa, you're kind of like, what happened here? That's not what I signed up for. And so it's this echo chamber effect that I would really encourage people to try and resist, because the reality is we have to seek to understand first. And as we do that, then we can tolerate other points of view without diminishing them, because it's okay to say, I understand what you're saying, I just think a little bit differently. And that's not derogatory, that's just straight up. And so I wish there was more of that kind of interactivity in social media today, but I just don't know if we're ever going to reach that.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because our resident scholar is Mark Jenkins, and he's been doing a lot of research around Wyoming, talking with publishers of newspapers. And one thing that has come up as a big concern is that even though the local newspaper is trying to stay very centered, not be liberal, not be conservative, but what's happening is they get a lot of criticism because people in their community are getting their news on Facebook.
Yeah, it's a big problem because Facebook is not a substitute for news.
Right.
because there are a number of news-like things and opinions and commentary that enters into the realm of social media that hasn't been vetted. It hasn't been created by ethically trained journalists. It's been created by advocates, and there's nothing wrong with advocacy, man. If you're passionate about something, advocate for it all day long, but that can't take the place of objectivity in what news sources, journalistic news sources, are there to provide. So it is a big challenge for publishers to break through and explain that in a world of chaotic and varying opinions and views, come to the center and just see what it's like straight up. And that's what we're going to give you. Now, that involves trust. So if I'm going to say that, our track record looking back better prove it. And if it doesn't, then I'm not going to have the trust in that person to do as I just suggested. So that's where we have to look at ourselves as news publishers and make sure we're consistent, we're towing the line with our ethics and our reliability and across the entire spectrum of stories. And so if we make mistakes, we got to be the first one to step up and admit it and correct it and move on and do a better job learning from it.
Let me ask you something before we leave this conversation, because this just came into my brain. Because I was thinking, as a father and someone who's involved in current issues every day, but our millennials aren't voting. And do you ever ask your kids about why they should vote?
Absolutely. Our kids have been encouraged to vote since they turned 18. I have two that are over 18. And, we just, even though I'm in this business, we sit down with the election section that we publish and we kind of read through and generate ideas and talk about candidates, talk about, the issues. We've got an extra penny sales tax issue on our ballot this year. We talked about it. So I think, let me just step back and say, the civics class at Jackson Hole High School has definitely made an impression on the friend groups of my kids, because there really hasn't been that hesitancy. They see it as a rite of passage, being 18 years and above, to participate in their democracy, which is super cool. And I would imagine that same civics orientation is replicated across the state of Wyoming. And I think our educators are doing a great job in that regard. That being said, I think I just go back to that point earlier about apathy. Unfortunately, there are kids these days that feel they don't have, that they can't make a difference. And this is a broad generalization. Please excuse me for doing that. But if you had to slice out, Emmy, that group you just referenced, I think they just don't think their voice counts. And hopefully they'll meet someone along the line that encourages them otherwise, and they'll fold in and be one of the voting public.
I hope so too, because I think, and I don't just think it's apathy, because I have a very passionate son, and it's more the damage that fake news and social media has done to make them so confused on what is the truth. What do people really stand for? Like, they might say something in a blog, but can you trust it?
I will just say that this whole notion of fake news, in my view, Kevin Olsen view, really started to surface in the era when blogging and social media and opinion-oriented programming, whether it be on television or radio, started to rise. Because prior to the term fake news ever came into the conversation, I never heard it. Working for local publishers and working for a large Southern California metropolitan newspaper, I'd never heard of fake news before. So unfortunately, just in the last, 5 years, it's surfaced, and it's perpetuated by imposters who purport to be news reporters, but they don't work for a journalistic news organization.
Right. They propose to be experts, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just that kind of stuff is what discourages me. And I do have a lot of hope for our young people, but I feel like the people who are in our age group really need to really figure out how to step up and like, you know, make a difference in cutting that that kind of way that we deal with journalism, really.
Yeah. Yeah. It just comes down to belief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emmy.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.